For years, viewers of Finding Bigfoot saw Ranae Holland as the skeptical voice of reason, the scientist who challenged eyewitness claims, demanded hard evidence, and refused to let emotion steer the investigation. But ever since the show disappeared without answers, she stayed quiet until now. After months of silence, Ranae finally steps forward with new information about events behind the camera, unexplained encounters that never made it to air, and a discovery that may force her to rethink her entire career. Subscribe for more cryptid investigations just like this, because once you hear what she's been holding back, you'll never look at Finding Bigfoot the same way again. Ranae Holland's childhood in the Pacific Northwest wasn't defined by Bigfoot obsession like many assume. If anything, it was defined by silence, the quiet, uneasy stillness of the deep Washington woods. Her father worked as a respected fishing guide, the type of man locals trusted more than any forest ranger. He knew every creek bend, every animal sign, every ridge where elk huddled in winter. On slow summer evenings, he would point out unusual things to a young Ranae. Gouges in cedar bark 8 feet high, or heavy tracks in deadfall that didn't match cougar or bear. "It's the woods talking," he would say, brushing the hair from her eyes. Back then, she believed him. She was just a kid. Everything changed at 16 when her father passed suddenly from an unexpected cardiac event. The loss fractured her family's relationship with the land. Hunting trips stopped. Silence returned. But it felt colder now, crueler. To cope, Ranae escaped into textbooks. She immersed herself in biology, ecology, and primate anatomy. She built her identity on measurable data, not folklore. By the time she entered graduate school, she carried a chip on her shoulder the size of an old-growth stump. Believing in anything without proof felt reckless, even childish. Classmates noticed she never joked about cryptids like others. Professors found her meticulous, almost aggressive in her insistence that science shouldn't bend to comfort. She published early research on primate stride mechanics and vocalization patterns, gaining praise for her skepticism. When whispers of her father's old journals resurfaced, notebooks filled with strange vocal recordings and footprint sketches, she refused to read them. She boxed them away, literally, in her mother's attic. Science was her armor now. Students who worked with her said she didn't hate Bigfoot believers. She hated the distraction the myth caused. She saw it as a parasite draining resources from real conservation efforts, which is why, years later, when producers from Finding Bigfoot approached her, she only agreed to be the skeptic. She wasn't just counterbalance for TV. She was defending the version of herself she'd built to survive. Deep down, the woods still whispered, but Ranae wasn't going to listen. Not yet. After graduate school, Ranae's work shifted toward salmon ecology along the Oregon and Washington river systems, a position that required long stretches of time in the field. She studied predator-prey relationships, monitored spawning behavior, and logged changes in forest canopy density, standard assignments for a rising biologist. But almost immediately, she began noticing patterns that didn't fit the textbooks. Elk herds that historically migrated south in October suddenly reversed course mid-season. Black bear populations abandoned territories that offered abundant food, instead taking routes that forced them into human settlements. She logged these anomalies carefully, expecting confirmation from other researchers, but the responses came back quiet and uneasy. During a survey near the Clackamas River Basin, her field microphone recorded a low, resonant call at 2:14 a.m. The sound wasn't canine, too deep. It wasn't cougar, too slow in cadence. Its pitch modulation suggested a large chest cavity, but the waveform was oddly flat, lacking the harmonic signature of known mammals. When she brought the recording into the lab, the spectrogram software produced a tag she'd never seen before: unknown mammalia. No match. Her supervisor told her to archive it and focus on verifiable data. The instruction wasn't dismissive, it was nervous. Over the next 9 months, more oddities appeared. River otters, abandoned dens with fresh fish caches untouched. Ravens circled vacant forest clearings without visible carrion. A cluster of Douglas firs were stripped of bark nearly 12 feet up, far above deer scrape height. Local hunters she interviewed described hearing something that talked back and forth across valleys, deep and rhythmic, almost patterned. One man refused to let her quote him. whispering, "Some things don't want to be found." That's when she learned a quiet truth no academic dared voice publicly. Several field biologists across Washington had been meeting informally for years, comparing unclassified recordings. Most refused to publish. The consensus wasn't that the data was wrong, it was that acknowledging it would drag their careers into ridicule. At home, Ranae found herself dreaming of forests shifting like ocean tides. She'd wake to her phone buzzing, colleagues forwarding fresh anomalies, each prefaced with the same words, "Do not attach my name." Science had always been her shield against the unknown. Now it seemed like a wall that someone, or something, was gently tapping on from the other side. When producers from Finding Bigfoot first reached out in 2010, Ranae assumed it was a mistake. She'd spent her adult life distancing herself from her father's cryptid curiosities, and the idea of joining a television show about them felt like betrayal. But the producers weren't looking for a believer. They wanted contrast, a trained biologist who could scrutinize claims, analyze evidence, and ground the show in rational thought. They needed someone who, on camera, wouldn't hesitate to say, "No, this doesn't add up." And Ranae fit the mold perfectly. She negotiated only one condition. She would never be scripted to pretend belief. Authentic skepticism was non-negotiable. The network agreed publicly that honesty made the show credible. Privately, executives saw an even more valuable dynamic: tension. Skeptic versus believer drives viewership. But what viewers never saw was the briefing binder Ranae received before filming. Inside were dozens of witness statements never aired, most from individuals who refused to be filmed: wilderness firefighters, tribal wildlife technicians, and 2 retired forest law enforcement officers. They all described eerily consistent details: broad shoulders, forward-leaning posture, mid-foot flexibility uncommon in humans, and eyeshine resembling deep amber. These weren't campfire storytellers, they were professionals, trained to observe. Production nights became controlled chaos. Ranae stood behind camera crews listening to vocalizations echoing through the tree line. Whoops, knocks, and deep chest-shaking roars no animal textbook could account for. As the skeptic, she knew the audience expected her to provide rational explanations, and she tried. But privately, she began cataloging similarities, frequency ranges, call intervals, suspected territorial spacing. Off-camera, she reviewed evidence with her co-hosts. She'd point out stride patterns or hair samples under ultraviolet examination. Sometimes she found an explanation: bear drag marks, elk alarm calls. But other times, her scientific toolbox came up empty. By the end of the first season, producers noticed something subtle in her field notes. She'd stopped writing "unknown," likely misidentified animal. Instead, the notes read "unknown," consistent with prior reports. Her skepticism wasn't weakening, it was evolving, and when she realized how much the network chose not to air, she began to wonder whether she was being included to debunk the unknown or to make not acknowledging it more palatable to the public. Halfway through filming the Montana episode, the crew set up on the edge of dense timber, where local hunters reported something pacing tree lines at night. It was routine: thermal cameras scanning, parabolic mics recording ambient sound, cast members whispering into radios. Then, just after 1 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply. Ranae noticed the breath from camera operators suddenly fogging. Before she could comment, the thermal operator stiffened. On his monitor, a figure appeared, upright, broad-shouldered, and moving with deliberate, measured steps. Bear's lumber, elk bolt. This paced. It kept exactly 50 yards away, matching the team's lateral movement as if testing boundaries. The thermal signature glowed bright white, but there was no visible light source. Ranae listened carefully. The cadence of the footfalls was heavy, but not clumsy. 4 steps. Pause. 4 steps. Something intelligent enough to conceal noise. Suddenly the radios crackled with static, the kind that swallows voices. Parabolic microphones fuzzed. Ranae raised a hand to signal movement toward the tree line, but a producer intercepted her, whispering sharply, "Back to vehicles." Now it wasn't fear in his voice, it was protocol. Back at the lodge, Ranae reviewed the thermal footage frame by frame. The leg extension was beyond human stride. Muscle mass bulged visibly through the heat signature. She noted mid-foot flexation, rare in hoax suits. The next morning, she was told legal needed to verify chain of custody on the clip. 2 weeks later, she learned the footage was pulled entirely for insufficient clarity. When the episode aired, viewers saw none of it. The pacing figure never existed, at least not on television. That night was the first time Ranae wondered if the network's silence wasn't about credibility, but containment. As Ranae's exposure on Finding Bigfoot grew, so did the number of scientists quietly contacting her. Field ecologists, forestry analysts, acoustic specialists, people trained to document anomalies without sensationalism. They shared private folders containing spectrograms, hair fibers with undocumented medulla patterns, and audio files exhibiting harmonic structures too complex for known North American mammals. These researchers didn't want credit. They wanted someone with a public platform to confirm they weren't imagining things. At first, Ranae assumed the silence from academia was just professional caution. But then, something stranger happened. People stopped responding. An ecologist from British Columbia, who had spent 5 years mapping vocalization clusters, suddenly canceled their correspondence. His university page disappeared, and his public email bounced back as undeliverable. Months later, Ranae heard through a colleague that he'd signed a non-disclosure agreement related to undocumented fauna. Another contact, a wildlife technician from Idaho, had been tracking large bipedal prints across riverbeds, prints with dermal ridges too crisp to be fabricated. She'd planned to publish a paper comparing them to primate foot structure. Before submission, her grant was revoked. She left her position entirely. When Ranae attempted to reach her, a family member answered and simply said she can't talk about that anymore. One of the most concerning cases involved a federal forestry analyst who had documented activity in the Cascades. He had classified dozens of sound signatures as Category U, uncertain vocalization. After multiple unexplained reassignments, he stopped attending community forums. His remaining research was archived under restricted access. A mutual friend later confided that he'd been pressured into signing paperwork to protect ecosystem-level confidentiality. The phrasing was so vague it bordered on meaningless, yet it carried legal teeth. When Ranae compared these disappearances with corresponding silence in peer groups, she noticed a pattern. The people who got closest to acknowledging a species, not just prints or sounds, but population estimates, went quiet permanently. The strangest moment came when she re-examined her own archived emails. Threads she clearly remembered saving were missing entire attachments. In their place, blank file references labeled "removed at sender's request." Except she hadn't received a request. Someone had accessed the thread server side. She confronted a colleague in private, asking how often data went missing. He sighed, glanced around the parking lot, and asked a single question. "Do you really think the government would rather tell the public something new is out here, or pretend nothing is?" It was then Ranae realized the Bigfoot community wasn't just fractured by ridicule. It was being quietly curated by forces that understood silence better than discovery. In 2017, Ranae attended the estate auction of a retired backcountry ranger she had once met during production. He was a quiet man, the sort who remained stationed in high-ridge fire towers during lightning seasons, the kind of ranger who saw more than he ever reported. Among the boxes of maps and faded topo prints, Ranae noticed a small metal tin labeled only with the year 1989. Inside were 4 microcassettes, old field recordings, the type used before digital audio became standard. Late that night, in her garage, she threaded the first tape. The hiss of analog static filled the speakers, followed by distant owls, wind, and then something else. A howl, but not canine. Its resonance sat lower, subharmonic tones only large air cavities can produce. Then came a second howl, overlapping just slightly, harmonizing. No North American mammal produces coordinated vocal layering like that. Ranae replayed the segment dozens of times, mapping its pitch bend. The pattern almost resembled syllables. Intrigued, she converted the recordings to digital and imported them into university spectrogram software. The color bands, visual fingerprints of sound, displayed a bifurcated structure, two distinct vocal folds acting in unison. Only a handful of primates can do that. Humans can't, wolves can't, bears can't. And at the very bottom of the graph, barely visible, was a third harmonic flicker, like a hidden signature. When she casually presented the file during an academic lunch, two graduate assistants visibly stiffened. They weren't skeptical, they were frightened. One quietly asked where she acquired it. After she answered, both declined to attach their names to any discussion. The conversation ended abruptly when one of them received a text and excused himself, leaving his meal untouched. 48 hours later, Ranae received an email from a department address she didn't recognize. It requested, in the interest of wildlife safety, that she surrender all digital copies of the 1989 recordings. Attached was a document citing a federal wildlife privacy statute she'd never encountered. She ignored it. A week later, the tin vanished from her garage. Nothing else was disturbed. She checked her home cameras. The feed froze between 2:03 a.m. and 2:11 a.m. No glitch, no error code, just silence. The missing tin wasn't the disturbing part. It was the replacement, a single sticky note resting exactly where it had been. It read only, "You have your answer." Ranae still has encrypted duplicates of the audio, but she no longer plays them casually. She plays them the way you might listen to a storm, aware that something outside is awake and listening back. By 2018, Ranae had gathered enough compelling anomalies, audio signatures, stride metrics, territorial patterns, that any curious scientist would have attempted publication. But publishing was exactly what she couldn't do. In academia, Bigfoot wasn't a fringe subject, it was professional suicide. Tenure committees didn't entertain biological ghosts. Grants weren't awarded to researchers who questioned mammalian catalogs. Conservation boards avoided the word cryptid like an invasive fungus. The silence wasn't accidental, it was systemic. She'd watched what happened to those who tried. A respected wildlife biologist from Utah submitted a paper comparing mid-foot strike casts to primate locomotion. Within months, his funding dried up. A promising ecologist from Oregon hinted at an unidentified omnivore affecting elk distribution. Suddenly, her university merged her department and eliminated her research focus. These weren't coincidences, they were administrative scalpel cuts. Precise, clean, undisclosed. Sponsors pressured the Finding Bigfoot production team too. Advertisers wanted curiosity, not confirmation. A mystery that never resolves is cheaper to broadcast than a truth that demands action. The show thrived on ambiguity. Ranae's skepticism wasn't just welcomed, it was useful. It kept the narrative safe, playful, profitable. Anytime an episode leaned too close to legitimacy, executives would step in. Thermal figures disappeared, hair sample discussions were trimmed, spectrogram analysis segments were shortened to seconds, then cut entirely. Behind closed doors, even her castmates felt the weight. They joked off camera about being allowed only one step closer to truth at a time, never two. Ranae noticed each time someone spoke too confidently about physical evidence, producers would later take them aside for a tone conversation, not censorship steering. Her fear wasn't ridicule, it was isolation. If she spoke publicly, she risked becoming a mascot for conspiracy circles, used, quoted, distorted, and if she were wrong, she'd permanently stain the careers of anyone who trusted her. So she buried herself deeper into scientific rigor, building walls of data no one would ever see. But something outside academia shifted. After a particularly violent wildfire season, sightings surged, not north, where habitat recovered, but south, collapsing toward human encroachment. Ranchers found livestock kills with pressure fractures, inconsistent with mountain lions. Trail cameras captured blurred, upright silhouettes crossing logging roads in desperate, injured gaits. The population wasn't expanding, it was fleeing. That realization haunted Ranae more than any roar in the dark. Silence was no longer caution, it was negligence. Something was forcing a reclusive species out of its centuries-old territory. A predator? Resource collapse? She didn't know, but she knew this. When a top-tier omnivore begins migrating off-pattern, ecological equilibrium equilibrium is breaking, and silence, hers included, was becoming part of the problem. For the first time, skepticism felt like cowardice. Everything changed in the spring of 2024. Forestry drones in southern Washington, originally deployed to monitor fire risk, captured something crossing a burn-scarred hillside at 3:14 a.m. The figure was upright, barrel-chested, and covering ground with unnatural efficiency. It moved through deadfall and jagged logs, as if stepping over shoeboxes. The operator, a former student of Ranae's, clipped a 5-second segment and sent it through an encrypted link. When Ranae analyzed the footage, frame by frame, micropixel compression revealed muscle contraction at the shoulders and thighs, details impossible for costumes or prosthetics. Its stride revealed mid-tarsal flexibility, a trait seen only in great apes. Even more concerning, its left arm hung lower, slightly swollen. The creature was injured. 2 days later, another drone documented a similar figure sprinting across a drainage cut, leaping a fallen cedar in a clean upward arc. No human could accelerate like that with an injured limb. Ranae compared both clips with her archived vocal recording from 1989, noticing patterns aligning with distress calls in chimp communication. Something was chasing this species, not predation, but displacement. Habitat pressure had reached a threshold. Ranae compiled the evidence into a private report and attempted quiet contact with regional wildlife offices. Every agency replied with the same scripted line: no classified fauna consistent with description. When she forwarded the spectrogram overlays, she received no response at all. That was the moment she understood. The silence wasn't confusion, it was policy. Last month, Ranae broke her silence in a controlled interview. Calmly, she stated the species exists and is retreating south. She emphasized no threat to humans. These animals avoid us. The real danger, she claims, is whatever occupies the territory now vacated. Rangers have begun reporting resonant, ultra-low roars, too deep for primates. Livestock carcasses show crushing force without tearing, suggesting something large hunts by impact, not teeth. Her closing line was chilling: if we only look at what's running, we'll never prepare for what's pursuing it. Her message wasn't hype, it was ecological mathematics. Something big just moved onto the board, and this time, silence won't protect anyone.